And I think I can say safely that we, as a whole, I'm not talking about these two, are not particularly knowledgeable about the Middle East, and certainly about contemporary writing in the Middle East. Because it's a part of the region where really it's divided in so many different ways, in politics, in gender, in what's been going on there now, the turmoil that's going on in Gaza, in Syria, in Iraq, is all, we're confused. And one of the things that I think we've learned, I knew about it because I'm a Sunni Muslim, that there has been, you know, what Islam is some homogeneous, homogeneous entities. Not. It's the Shia and Sunni division is coming out big time now. It's always been there. It comes up and goes away, and it's come back again. And besides that, you know, we have the other faiths there, the Christians, the Jews, the Yazidis, and others too. And I'm mentioning religion because religion is very important in that part of the world. The play made so clear when it comes to England, it's the land of unbelief and therefore freedom. This is an interesting thing we can discuss, Rashid, in a minute. Now, very quickly about Rashid, because I've only got 35 minutes, so let me introduce them to you. Rashid is an accomplished playwright. You saw it tonight. I mean, fantastic, Rashid. And I've seen it develop from when I saw the preview to now. Very tense, very funny, and some of it poignant, actually, very poignant. You're a screenwriter, you're a journalist, and you write and you've written a number of plays before, one about Barack Obama and his illegal flatmate, and you were a graduate of the Royal Court Theatre's Young Writers Group. But your day job is writing about crime, arts and politics at the London Evening Standard, which I reckon is probably a good topic for you to write your play. Our second panellist, Hassan Abdulrazzak, is also an eminent playwright, and like Rashid, I could spend hours talking about him, but I won't. His first play, Baghdad Wedding, was staged in the Soho Theatre in 2007, was also broadcast by Radio 3, I think that's right. And he's won lots of prizes, and his play, The Prophet, was based upon extensive interviews, and we should talk about that, Hassan, when we get there, in Cairo with revolutionaries and soldiers and journalists, and cab drivers, which is very important. And you've translated a play about Palestinian writing too, which you can get in a book form. So really what we're going to be talking about is what is the new writing coming out from the Middle East and slightly further east, Rashid. I look to you for the further east, although I look to you slightly about further east in a minute. So let me turn to you, Rashid, first. Tell me, you know, the book, and I've got it in my bag, I'll dig it up when you talk here, of short stories, it's the early short stories by Hassan Abdulrazzak, obviously affected you. I'm pleased to say, as Nick said, I was on the board of English Pen and on their translation committee, and the translation committee gave an award to Hassan Abdulrazzak's second book called The Iraqi Christ, and I'll show that in a minute. You know, what particularly caught you to read Abdulrazzak's stories, and why is he important in Middle Eastern literature today, and how does he fit into the changing and really stressful politics of the region? If you could sort of kick it off with that.
I actually read the book because Nabil, the leading man who plays Carlos, tonight came to me with this collection of short stories, and he said, you should really read these short stories, they're fantastic and they've got a lot of potential, and we might be able to develop them you know, into something, a film or a play. And I read them, and they were brilliant short stories. Very dark, a dark humour. They feel quite, I was saying to Raficq earlier, they feel quite Latin American, kind of like Borges or Kafka, kind of just dark quality. And we went to Nick, and we were just talking about the potential of developing these stories, and we thought, actually, it's going to be very hard to develop these stories because they're very psychological, they're very internal. In the short story, the Salim character comes to the Netherlands and marries a woman who's fat and has childlike features, which I thought, that's not going to be easy to cast an actress and say when he's fat childlike features. So I thought particularly dramatically interesting as well. So it was the older woman, younger man dynamic, and the fact of him dying and going mad. And what really touched me, because I feel like a bit of a imposter really, because I'm not from the Middle East, I'm not an expert in Middle East writing at all. And Hassan Abdulrazzak has really lived this story. He was a filmmaker in Iraq, and he had to flee, and he made the journey to overland to Finland, and he kind of had this experience. And the first-hand account of the kind of the death and the destruction, we read about in the news, and we get very moving what's happening today. It's happening today, in Iraq. But just the fact that you could find some sort of humour and find some kind of humanity in his stories, and it was just taking that for me and trying to kind of do it justice and trying to take it in a different direction, trying to say something about Britain, something that I feel a bit more qualified to write about. But subsequently, since then, Hassan has had this kind of great acclaim, as very well deserved. His first collection of short stories was The Madman of Freedom Square, which has the short story Nightmares of Carlos Fuentes, the second collection, Iraqi Christ, which won the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize this year, first ever Arab writer to do so, and he was described by The Guardian as the greatest living writer of Arab fiction. So it's fantastic, and it's quite interesting for me because I think it touches on a lot of things that we'll probably go on to discuss, but the fact that he is an Iraqi writer living in Finland, writing in Arabic, then translated to English, that's done well over here, but he couldn't get published in the Middle East anywhere, largely because his stuff is too dark or deemed to be sacrilegious. But now he's getting some kind of attention in the Middle East. And it's quite interesting when we talk about Middle Eastern writers. Actually, it's not as straightforward as it perhaps once was, that you'd have a literary scene in one country. And all of these writers that we're talking about, and we'll talk about kind of Asian, Indian, Pakistani writers. That a lot of them are writing in the diaspora, and I think that touches into some of the themes in the play about identity and shifting identity. That we kind of reinvent ourselves, and we ask these questions about identity and how perhaps we've gone from having a national identity, particularly a religious identity, particularly for Muslims. I mean, that's happened in my lifetime, that from being Asian to being Pakistani to now everyone seems to identify themselves as a Muslim, primarily, before other aspects. So, we're really going off on a tangent here, but I think I would implore you all to read Hassan Abdulrazzak, and if that is a really good way into kind of Middle Eastern writers who are now getting a lot more attention on the back of his success, which is a good thing. And I think I'm sure Hassan can speak a lot more than that.
But Hassan Abdulrazzak is a good writer per se.
Fantastic,
and it's been well translated too. You touched on a very important point, is how often writers in the Middle East don't get published in the Middle East because of suppression, censorship, and all sorts of things. And in many ways, they look to the West, irony of ironies, to get published, have some translation, and then get world recognition. I read somewhere that the so-called Arab Booker Prize is in Abu Dhabi. Part of the game is to win the Booker Prize so you can get published in the West, in England. So therefore you get recognised. So it's a hell of a state of affairs there. But before I go to Hassan here, I just wanted to explore a little bit more about the further east thing very quickly. Because we're not just talking about Arab literature in the Middle East. Further east to me means Iran, and I'm going to talk to Hassan about Iran in a minute, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Pakistani writing is recognised here. I mean, in translation, we have a lot of Pakistani writers who are famous and well known and win prizes, etc. What is your feeling about that? Because you've been to Lahore.
Sure, and I'm from a Pakistani background. I think it's interesting because I think we were saying this before early on that Indian writing particularly has had a lot of attention. 70s, 80s, Salman Rushdie, those types of people, and then you get one person often has international success, and I think that at the forefront would probably be Mohsin Hamid, who wrote The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and then his recent How to Get Filthy Rich and Rising Asia since then. And then a lot of people who are perhaps writing for 10, 20 years, suddenly there's attention on that country, and those kind of people tend to be discovered. So you can criticise it, but it's also a good thing in a way that that's what it takes. And I think also people are just because Pakistan's in the news every day, the death, destruction, bombs, and all that stuff, and then those people living through that. I think people are interested in those voices, and they have interesting stories to tell. And I think for me, I think like I said with Hassan Abdulrazzak, this kind of people who are living day to day with violence and life and death stakes, that inherently makes interesting material, interesting subject matter to write about. And I think that's where Pakistan perhaps has a parallel with Iraq, that there are people who are dealing with these subjects, and it comes back to what you were saying about writing perhaps for a Western audience, because I think, you know, Mohsin Hamid has been successful with the Reluctant Fundamentalists, writing about a suicide bomber, talking to an American. So I think it's, you know, it's always a fine line there, you know, to ask yourselves the questions, which audience are we writing for? Maybe the real Pakistani writers writing about Pakistan culture and society aren't getting the attention in the West, so does that make them less valid, or, you know, I don't know.
Well, I suspect not. And also I think what's happening is, with social media, which has become so alive in the Middle East, certainly, and the whole of the Egyptian revolution that seems to fail, but through social media, Facebook, Twitter, blogging, etc. People are very savvy of that in certain Middle East, I'm sure that they're in Pakistan. But just telling to you about the Middle East, I mean, as I see it, Hassan, you know, tell us something about, you know, we have novelists, we have playwrights, you're a playwright, and you and I talked briefly about poetry. Poetry is very important in the Muslim world. In Pakistan, they have a thing called mushaira, where people go to listen to poetry as you and I would go to listen to a rock concert. You know, they participate. They go wow, wow, and the words are replied. And the languages are so beautiful. I don't agree with your character saying Arabic is rubbish. It's a beautiful language, not you. So Hassan, you know, I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. Because we talk about a reading which is an extremist. I mean, very quickly, another book supported by English Pen is called Writing Revolution, well worth reading essays. And one of the essays, a Tunisian, says at the beginning of his essay, I mean, this is amazing. He says, you know, really, you would go mad. This is how living in my dear country, Tunisia, not Iraq, made me feel. I concluded, not entirely seriously, that every Tunisian who, like me, looked closely at the situation in his homeland must carry within him the seeds of such a madness, the early symptoms of a split personality. Do you think is right? Does writing coming out of the Middle East come from these dividing streams of split personalities? Tell us something about the plays and the poetry of the Arab world. And then also, sorry, I want to add this, tell me about Iran, because I'm a great lover of Iranian movies. Yeah.
Okay, that's a short one.
Keep you going.
I'll address your point by picking up on the thing you said about censorship. I think you probably slightly overstated this, the idea of censorship. The problem in the Arab world, and I touched this in my second play, The Prophet, is not so much censorship, it's the whole system of the publishing. It's more based on a self-publishing model. So authors tend to go to the publishers, pay a certain fee, publish, and then it's luck whether the book will get reviewed and so on, and then they'll sell the copies themselves. It works more on that model, and that creates a certain kind of odd landscape, because certain people might get picked up and reviewed and so on. And the
reviews where?
Reviewed in the Arabic world, and then they might get picked up by a Western publisher who translate the book on the basis of that. The Arab writers want to be published in English, not necessarily to overcome censorship. That can happen in certain cases, but I wouldn't say that's the overriding problem. It's more because their rights are more secured by the Western companies. They know they're going to get paid, basically. Whereas with the Arab publishers, it's kind of hit and miss. It depends which publisher you're with. They can not tell you how many copies have been sold and so on, and you might just have to be kind of self-promoting. So I just wanted to pick up on that.
It would differ in different countries, but like Saudi Arabia would probably have much stronger censorship than Lebanon.
Saudi Arabia is very schizophrenic. There was recently a book fair in Saudi Arabia where the morality police came in and demolished the stand for the very famous Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, because they read something in the book that they didn't agree with, some line about God and they completely demolished. It's on YouTube, you can see it. In that very same book fair, the books of Richard Dawkins were being sold, and they didn't know that.
In Arabic?
Yeah, the God Delusion in Arabic was being sold in that same book fair, and they just left that alone. So that actually encapsulated the kind of random aspect. My uncle, Mahmoud al-Bayati, had a novel that he wrote set in Sweden, which has some sex scenes, banned by Al-Azhar committee in Cairo, and they said that book of poetry has to be banned. They didn't even know what category of literature it was. So the banning is random, it's sometimes politicized, but it's not the main issue. The main issue is the way, in my opinion, the main issue is the way that the publishers are set up, and the rights of the authors are not often preserved. And so seeking to be published in the West is all about that. So having access to something that's more secure.
And bigger market.
To get to the poetry aspect, now a lot of poets, I notice, tend to just put out their poems on Facebook and get instant feedback. They publish them eventually in collections, but in a way they are much more interested in seeking that audience. And of course most poets, and this is I think even true here in England, they have some day job or other that is sustaining them. Maybe they work in a newspaper or something like that.
Really.
Yeah. And so for them the collection is just, they're not really looking that they're going to make money out of it. Very few poets can really make money out of it, and even they have some other needs. But that culture of Facebook and the instant feedback is interesting. So you can follow certain poets and find out.
So social media does play a very important role in this. Yeah. So what about the theatre? I mean, there is a lively theatre. I suspect it could be in Kuwait. I don't know about other parts of the Arab world. You know, the theatre that could translate into Western people reading it or looking at it as we've done with
from my experience, I haven't. I know that there is a lively scene in Tunisia, but I haven't experienced firsthand.
Would that be in French or in Arabic?
In both. Well, in both language. In both.
Yeah.
But the very lively scene is in Beirut, which I've experienced firsthand. Mm-hmm. So Beirut has a very rich theatre culture. Of course, the practitioners there will tell you, we are lacking this and we're lacking that, but it is very strong, and the productions I've seen there are first class. There is a lady called Nadine Labaki who made the film called Caramel.
Oh, so beautiful.
Yes, and she does very commercial theatre in Beirut. There is a very good quality. They did Neil Lebu's Something to Be Pretty. You might remember that play. It was on the Almeida not that many years ago. Reasons to Be Pretty, I think it's called. And they did a fantastic production of that, which I saw in Beirut. So, and then it has its own underground culture as well, where you can see things in buildings that are not that different from here, and they will do various events.
But would the plays be satirical, critical of the regime, critical of politics?
They tend to be, the underground stuff tends to be a little bit more abstract, and you can have multiple readings, including touching on religious and so on, but maybe also on the philosophical side. Mm-hmm. Partly maybe because Lebanon has that connection with France, and so they're very influenced by the French philosophers and so on. And that tends to touch.
So what sort of audience would go to that? Both in terms of age, of religious faith.
The more avant-garde stuff will attract a young audience, and of course the Lebanese. Lebanon is a country I'm very fascinated by, and I'm writing a play about it at the moment. They're very, they're super intellectual. They're very well read, and they come with high expectations because they've seen stuff from around the world, wherever they live. It's a country of immigrants as well, and they tend to go out and come back. So it's a very lively place where I would say it has a rich literary scene.
And would the sort of the Sunni Shia divide, etc., be forgotten when the people or what? I mean, I suspect it's a sort of middle class that goes to the theatre.
It is a middle class. It is. I mean, if you sit in an auditorium in Beirut, you will hear French and English above Arabic among the audience, and I don't think that probably means that the Shia, who are the ones who support Hezbollah, or at least Hezbollah claims to speak in their name. I wouldn't say they're not a homogeneous population. They might be less of an audience for such a theatre. It is. I mean, theatre. This is the problem of theatre always. It's it's a kind of, it is a privilege to go to the theatre around the world, and you need certain kind of money to be able to afford it.
What's going to poetry reading is something that's probably wider in expanse. And talking about poetry, let's go to Iran for a minute, because poetry in Iran is alive and well. So a taxi driver will quote Hafiz to you, no problem, or Rumi, or Attar. What is your feeling about the culture in Iran in terms of movies and?
Well, I find personally, I'm still educating myself about Iranian cinema because it's very rich. But I find the recent crop of films, particularly Farhadi's two films, A Separation and About Ili, absolutely inspiring. A Separation, I think. I said this. I was interviewed for something else about it on TV, and I said that this is more of a weapon for Iran than the nuclear bombs, because in a way, when you understand the country's culture, it makes it much harder to kill them. Really, I think it's a kind of it breaks the barriers down, and you see them as a people. And I think A Separation is a film that was revelatory for a lot of people who saw it, because it showed you the battle that's happening within that culture between the people who are much more conservative and the people who are looking to be more liberal. But at the same time, it showed you what a moral culture it is, how people grapple with moral questions, and in a very interesting and intriguing way. And as a film, it was just a superb drama. It was so well crafted. Every line there was very perfect. Every scene was well calibrated and tried to deserve. I think it won the Oscar.
It won some Berlin or something.
It was certainly nominated.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen Separation, but I did see about Ellie, and it starts very, young people going on holiday, etc. And in fact, my wife was sweet. She said, "My God, they're very sophisticated." I said, "Yes. Why shouldn't they? The Iranians, just because they cover their heads, it doesn't mean that they're not sophisticated." And what happens in the film? I don't know if you've seen it. It suddenly turns very serious, and it's like a Greek drama. It's handheld cameras too, and you go from laughter about young people, and you identify with it, to something else. I do recommend to see that film. Tell me, in Pakistan, are there any films coming out, Rashid?
Pakistan's actually got quite a good reputation in Asia for its film industry. Is dwarfed by Bollywood, across a lot of Asia. Bollywood is just as rampant. But there are actually a lot of the Pakistan dramas now going over to India, and I think it's because they've got smaller budgets, so they're a lot more kind of story, character-based, whereas the Indian ones tend to be a lot closer to Hollywood type kind of films. So they're getting quite a lot of attention as well. So there's kind of some good writing happening in television.
In television,
yeah.
Which would that travel over here or not? Do you think?
Probably only in the diaspora. I don't know if it would necessarily.
Subtitles?
Yeah, I think you probably really have to hunt it out.
Talking Channel 4.
Yeah, possibly.
Look,
3 a.m.
3 a.m. stop. Not 3. Look, we've only got 5 minutes, and then Nick's going to give me hell otherwise. I'm going to open up to the audience. Please ask questions. We've got about 5 to 10 minutes. Anyone wants to ask a question to these guys? So
I was hoping to hear something about what we might call intercultural writing of the sort that we saw this evening. I got the impression both the speakers were describing Arab literature or Middle Eastern literature about the Middle East as distinct from what we saw this evening. So, which was perhaps a way of relating how people here might or do experience the horrors that the West has created in Iraq in particular. And then we were repeatedly reminded of the chronology by the excerpts from the neoconservative speeches, and reminded of how that so-called humanitarian intervention brought about the horrors that it was supposedly aimed to prevent, and then is experienced in the story that we saw, the result that the person who, in fact, the victim, got sent back. So there might be a broader genre of such writing that I don't know about, but that's really what I expected to be hearing from the speakers.
Actually, what does Hassan do more of that sort of stuff?
I think, Hassan Blessing's story, which I'm recommending a lot, is that he is somebody who's had that experience firsthand. You know, I'm a second generation, child of second generation immigrants, but he's, lived that experience. All his stories is coming together, and it's something that we see constantly in the news, that we're talking about, people coming to Britain, what is Britishness, and having to, we see him in the play, learning this information that he thinks is going to make him into the perfect British man, but never quite happens, because I think the essence of Britishness, I don't think even any of us know yet. It's something that we're always trying to pin down, and it's a question I think we have to keep asking in each kind of age, and in terms of events that kind of transpire. And I just wanted people to think about the fact of the Iraq War, that something that has been gone and we all think is done and dusted.
No longer.
It's still back then. That there are some consequences for things that happened from 10 years ago, and this, I don't know if that is kind of in the ballpark of what you were talking about in terms of the intercultural relationship. But Britain and Iraq will forever have some sort of relationship that is going to be informed by the fact that Britain went to war and toppled Saddam. That's something that is going to keep feeding back, in some way or another for years to come.
And it's interesting also how, Salim or Carlos wants to be British, but he has his limits too. He wants to keep his ring on, which is very symbolic. And his wife had to sort of understand that, and there had to be give and take dialogue going on there. I don't know whether you feel, Hassan, about this intercultures.
I just invented the term.
No. But you're talking about how does the West and East get together in a play, in a scene, really.
I think that there are two ways of looking at that. One is you can be a writer from a particular region with a broader outlook, and I think Hassan Abdulrazzak fits in that. His short stories reference, as was mentioned, South American writing and other writing in other cultures and histories from other. There is a Iraqi poet, Saad Yusuf, for example, who has written extensively about Iraq, but also has written poems set in Italy's and castles he visited in Italy. And so a writer could be from a particular locale, but is looking outward and can speak in that kind of language, because literature is something that is shared by people. But there can also be a writer like me who is, I'm first generation Iraqi. I've lived here, but I'm really, I've been here since the age of 13. So England is my home, and I know this culture. And I tend to try and write plays. They're often almost the reverse of the play you saw today, where it would be an Iraqi going back to Iraq, but also getting it wrong, carrying with them Western baggage, not quite reading the landscape where they land. Often my plays tend to be in that kind of that mold. In terms of Iraq specifically, what has happened to Iraq, I think there is really there's a possibility for a deep exploration of that. How did a country like Iraq, that was on its way to becoming something like South Korea, at the beginning of the 80s, collapsed to the extent it has? Now that's a bigger question, and I think it's still out there to be captured with a play, saying, trying to plug a play.
More important, how do people here experience the legacy that the West created?
Yeah,
that's what we saw this evening. I don't understand why neither of you said anything about this.
How the people here how the people in Iraq experience the legacy?
No, England experience legacy.
Here, I'm totally baffled at why both of you seem to focus on Arab literature in the Middle East and said nothing about.
Well, that wasn't the topic we were asked to do. We talked about Arab literature in the Middle East, so that's why we focused on that.
Yeah, so sorry, it's really interesting to hear that. I mean, come on, these guys talking about this literature which describes Arab is really interesting, and that's what the play's about.
Yeah.
The play is about a guy who is between cultures. These guys are talking about that. You got that wrong, man. That is not the point. You missed it. What they said was really interesting.
Yeah. Sorry. We've only got 5 minutes left, so who else wants to talk? Last question.
I'd just like to say something. It's just tangential, really. I mean, in a way, it makes me feel ashamed. The notion of what it means to be British is such a sort of reductive notion. It just reminds me of the debate about education and Gove's idea about what education means, and somebody, a creativity person like Ken Robinson, would talk about a completely other way of being, and something much more bountiful, if you like. And so that's the thing that struck me about the fatuousness of the notion of being British, and who's British is it? Maybe I'm talking platitudes, but whose notion of being British? It's colonial and it's reductive and it's embarrassing.
But I think the thinking about that and talking about that in society, I mean, I said my wife is Swedish. In Sweden, it's quite black and white what it means to be Swede or a German, indeed even a French person. The barriers are tighter. I think we are a bit more fluid here and muddle along somehow. Do you want to say anything about that? Rashid, I
think you covered it.
Yeah.
Muddle along.
Yeah, muddle along.
British tradition, I think.
That's good. And we love it. Please, any other questions? Yeah, please.
I just wanted to share a personal perspective of watching the play as a British Iraqi myself, who's born and bred here. And it's sort of made for some uncomfortable watching it at times when you sort of see this kind of mouthpiece of Salim in terms of how he wants to reject his culture, wants to reject his background, wants to reject even his language, something which is so unique to a people, and you see the kind of things that he says and that sort of perception that often kind of exists from people who've seen nothing but destruction and coming somewhere else with a kind of optimistic, naive aim in a sense to turn their back on everything and embrace everything here. Watching it from my perspective, it's a case of it's unfortunate that people are led to such an extreme because of the destruction that they've seen. Ironically, destruction that was caused by the US and Britain in terms of the Iraq War, but then again coming back and seeing this as a saviour whilst turning their back on everything else that they've left.
No, I think that's really interesting. I think it's a lot of psychological pressure. It's like having your foot kind of in both camps and never kind of being one thing or the other. And I think actually I've seen it kind of an older generation, people from the 50s and 60s who perhaps came over here would try and fully embrace British culture, but actually you've seen children and grandchildren now perhaps going back to identity that is from the homeland, or a Muslim identity, or an Iraqi or a Pakistani identity, which is neither one thing or the other. And I think it's trying to navigate that, and I think with Salim trying to reject that, it just kind of emphasises the psychological pressure that he's under, and that kind of leads to that fracture, hopefully, that comes across.
Yeah. I think it's definitely accurate, and that's what's sad.
That's what made you uncomfortable a little bit. Because I mean, I do have a different version of identity. To me, it's much more work in progress. It never is fixed, and that's what worries me about a lot of Islamist thinking. It becomes fixed and totalitarian and overcomes you. Well, in fact, yes, I am a Muslim, but I'm also Western, I'm also European, and I love it. I mean, I love the whole mixture of it. I mean, I don't know what you feel about Hassan. You were born lived in Prague, born in Prague, a communist country.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I for my existence, I have no option other than to embrace this kind of multifaceted existence and not be rooted necessarily to one particular culture. There is a fantastic essay by Edward Said in his book Reflections on Exile about that kind of rootlessness and the advantage it gives you as well. Absolutely. Perspective.
Okay, Nick is giving me a dirty look. One
No,
more
not at all. Not at all.
One more question. I don't blame you. Anyone got another question? One more. There.
Could you say something about this current situation in Egypt in relation to people being able to write, censorship and repression of writers?
Well, it's quite sad what has happened with Egypt. There was a satirical program that started at the beginning of the revolution called Barnamij al-Barnamij. It was based on the Daily Show in the United States, and it was absolutely revolutionary. I mean, not to snow. At that time, because it was the first proper satirical program that laid into the political class, and that program survived Mubarak, the end of Mubarak. It survived the time of the Muslim Brotherhood, even though they tried to shut it down. And now under Sisi, it's been banned and it's off the air. And coming back to Sisi, it's almost like the whole thing's gone full circle, and we're back with the military rule.
I think they've always been there, to be honest, at the back. If I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure. No, please.
Yes, I think the military has been always the power behind. I mean,
The deeper state, sure, the deep state, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So,
As in Turkey used to be, yeah, yeah.
And I feel Pakistan also to a certain extent.
Pakistan,
Is that right? As
Yeah.
a military,
Yeah.
I believe.
And I think if you speak to ordinary Egyptians, reluctantly they had to approve CC's, you know.
But what, I don't know what the future is.
My experience of it is that it was a kind of a pull and push between stability and, you know, because the revolution's just gone on, and there's always demonstrations and there's always clashes, and people suddenly have the kind of urge of, we just want stability because the economy is just
They just want food on the table.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
The real motive behind stability is, you know, if you were to choose between democracy and even dignity to some extent, and food on the table, you know, the priority is to get food on the table. I mean, the situation in Egypt is so dire, so,
Absolutely.
you know, for the overwhelming majority. So,
See, democracy per se is
Yes.
not it's not the key to everything. That's
exactly.
what you're saying.
And also it seems that, you know, the relationship between Western governments and the Egyptian military are also deep-rooted.
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
they, you know, they're more comfortable dealing with the Egyptian military, be it US, France, Britain,
Yeah.
even Israel, than
And I think this is the sad aspect about the Egyptian revolution, and that is one would have liked to have seen, even though if you didn't agree with the Muslim Brotherhood, for that to play out and for them to lose an election.
Absolutely.
Rather than be
Yeah.
ousted in
Yeah.
the way
As
even
you-
though I said as somebody who has absolutely
And this is a rehabilitation of what happened in Algeria years and years ago
Sure.
with FIS, you know, and it's the same thing again. Okay, Nick, can I have one more question or not? Of course. One more question from someone before the Nick's alive.
So do you think there are more playwrights or in the Middle East right now because of what's happening, or do you think we are just more interested in what is happening right now and we want to produce play from writers from the Middle East?
So, I'm not sure I got your
Do
question.
you think there is more art going on in the Middle East, or we just attend nice plays about the Middle East because it's trendy? Sorry for that.
But I think there is art going on in the Middle East. Very much.
So can you repeat what you said?
You know, are we attending plays about the Middle East and reading about it because it's trendy and fashionable? What is going on in the Middle East? Is there art going on? Is there an art scene which is alive and well? Well, you've talked about Lebanon, but there must be also, I suspect,
I
Gulf states.
just translated a Syrian play by a writer called Abdullah al-Kafri, and it's set before all the events in Syria. And it's a play about love. It's about a woman who is seeking love, and her years are advanced. It touches very softly on few things, social things, but it's a play from that country that is completely unexpected. It's not about the political situation and so on. Now, I think that sort of art is a bit harder to bring, because usually here institutions want, give us the insight on Syria, or give us the insight on Libya, or something to answer what's happening politically. But often writers from that region might have other interests about love, about philosophy, about anything else that any other writer around the world would have. I would like to see more of those sort of plays, not just from the Arab world. I would like to see it from South America or anywhere else come to Britain. I think we have a huge advantage of that. People are very likely to read a best-selling Nigerian novel, but not necessarily watch a play set in Nigeria that is not about politics.
That's very fascinating, Hassan, because Rashid and I talked about earlier on, and we said, can you have the sort of pure art, as we call it in quotes, a novel like Proust coming from Pakistan or from the Middle East? I don't know.
I think there isn't a great deal. There's not a lot of plays coming from the Middle East or even anywhere else. In British theatre, I think actually is pretty insular. Apart from American stuff and the classics, you don't really even get a lot of European theatre. So further afield, it's very rare. You might get a handful of plays a year. So I think the more that we get, the better, because it's just
it'll open our minds.
Exactly. Just more. There's interesting stories out there that I think need to be told and seen.
Well, thank you everybody for sitting and hearing that conversation.